We've gone through all those Syriac translations, and that's fairly comprehensive for an introductory look at Syriac translations with 2 months worth of study there. We began back with the old Syriac Gospels through Tatian's Diatessaron, the Peshitta, the Philoxenian, the Harclean, the Palestinian translations, and we ended with George Lambsa's Bible. So we come to a new group of languages this evening, and we'll probably be looking at this twice, and those are the Coptic dialects and the Coptic translations. We move from Egypt southwesterly down to Egypt for our next group of early New Testament translations. These come just after the Syriac ones chronologically, that is, just after the earliest Syriac ones. And maybe I need to say something there. We covered all of those Syriac translations, even though, remember, the last of those, excluding Lambsa's Bible, the Harclean, really dates from the 7th century, 608, the Harclean translation, the beginning of the 7th century. So we are studying translations in more or less a chronological, systematic fashion, but once we got into Syriac studies, we stayed with all of the Syriac ones. Now that we're into Coptic dialects and Coptic translations, some of those, although they'll come after the time of the old Syriac Gospels, which ranks them second in order of time for New Testament translations, they come quite a bit earlier than the Harclean, the Syriac translation of the first decade of the 7th century A.D. So just remember that once we get into a certain family of languages, we may go a while there, and it may take up, well, for that it took up about 5 centuries, 5.5 to 6 centuries of time just looking at Syriac translations. Coptic does come after Syriac, but it only comes after the earliest, some of the earliest of the Syriac translations and not the later ones. What do we mean by Coptic? The word is spelled C-O-P-T-I-C. It's probably a term with which you're not that familiar, not yet anyway. It is the European form, C-O-P-T, Copt, is the European form of the Arabic Q-O-B-T, Copt, which is really a mispronunciation and should have originally been Q-I-B-T, which is Kipt, Q-I-B-T, which is Kipt. And this evidently is an abbreviation, or in some manner it's related to a Greek term, Aiguptios. A-I-G-U-P-T-I-O-S. Aiguptios. Which equals, this is how we end up with this Coptic. A-I-G-U-P-T-I-O-S, which equals Egyptian. It's the Greek term for Egyptian. The adjective Egyptian. So that's a long, roundabout way, but that's how we have to go. Copt, C-O-P-T, is the European pronunciation for the Arabic Copt, Q-O-B-T, which is really a mispronunciation and should have been Kipt, Q-I-B-T, which is an abbreviation of Aiguptios, A-I-G-U-P-T-I-O-S, which is the Greek spelling for Egyptian. So basically then, Copt, our top word up here, Copt, equals Egyptian. That's what we're going to, that's the way the word is used now. So Coptic means Egyptian. But it has to do with a certain period of time in Egypt's history. Coptic is the name of the language. Copt is the name of a people, the Copts. But not like Copts and robbers. C-O-P-T-S. The Copts. Who were they? They were native people in Egypt, indigenous people living from the 2nd to the 10th century A.D., who spoke the Coptic language, C-O-P-T-I-C, who spoke the Coptic language. The Coptic language began as one language, but it ends up with many, many dialects. I don't think we'll get too much into dialects, except maybe towards the end of tonight's teaching. I'm erasing this because I have more to write, but we'll be into that the next time we're on Coptic studies. We have the Sahidic, the Bohairic, and the so-called Middle Egyptian, the Fayumic, the Akhmimic, and the Sub-Akhmimic dialects. We will look at that later, though. Coptic. We're still talking about this particular language here because it is rather interesting. I said that the Copts, C-O-P-T-S, were the indigenous native people in Egypt living there from the 2nd to the 10th century A.D. Coptic's an Egyptian language. It's based on a Greek script. It's a Greek alphabet, but it's an Egyptian language. And it's just the most recent for this period. We're talking about the 2nd century A.D. It's just the most recent and the newest form of the long historical development of the Egyptian way of speaking and writing. Earlier, we had things such as now everybody, even back in grade school, is familiar with that term. Egyptian writing and speaking goes back probably to hieroglyphic, at least in its written form, hieroglyphic. Coptic is a development through a long history, a long process of time of hieroglyphic script, which then produced hieratic script, which then produced demotic script, which then produced Coptic. Now, if you know anything about Egypt, you know how long its history is, way back to the pharaohs. So we've had a lot of historical development going into what's taking place down here in Egypt. The famous Rosetta Stone, if you remember, we discussed that earlier in this class in biblical literature. The famous Rosetta Stone had 3 languages. It was a trilingual. It had hieroglyphic, it had demotic, and it had Greek. The Rosetta Stone discovered by one of Napoleon's men when they went to Egypt in the year 1799. And it finally was deciphered, and of course it was deciphered on the basis of the fact that scholars knew the Greek language. They knew a little bit of what demotic was all about. They didn't know anything about hieroglyphic. And of course hieroglyphic was the one thing they wanted to know something about, because here's the ancient, mysterious, early written form of the language in Egypt dating way back to the times of the pharaohs. And so that's a rather recent discovery now, just 200 and almost 300 years ago now, or 200 years ago rather, a discovery of the Rosetta Stone at a little place called Rosetta near the mouth of the Nile River in Lower Egypt, which is northern Egypt, of Greek, demotic, and hieroglyphic. I say that Coptic has kind of worked its way down through this, eventually evolving from hieroglyphic through hieratic to demotic, and then from demotic as well as Greek we end up with Coptic. Coptic, the script of Coptic is made up of the Greek uncial letters, 24, along with 7 demotic characters representing consonantal sounds not found in Greek, which just goes to show that it is a further development, the newest and most recent one here at this period of time, and of the Greek language, the Greek tongue, because we see its connection through demotic to hieratic and hieroglyphic. So what we have then would be a 31-letter alphabet, 24 Greek uncials, and 7 demotic characters. Now the Greek uncials are written slightly different, but if you knew what the Greek uncials look like, there'd be no difference in distinguishing them in the Coptic script. Of course, that doesn't really help except in pronouncing the words, because the vocabulary is entirely different. It's a Coptic, it's an Egyptian vocabulary. So you could transliterate into English what those letters were saying if you knew what those Greek letters said, skipping the 7 demotic characters that are mixed in to add in some consonantal sounds that are not found in Greek, but that wouldn't tell you anything. It's kind of like what you know about Hebrew now. You can read that, pronounce that, transliterate that into English, and then you can end up with a word spelled K-Z-O-F-Z-Y-M. You know, that's maybe what it would equal in your letters, and that wouldn't tell you anything then because you don't know what the word would be behind that. The Coptic language was basically spoken by the, well, I guess we could say the lower classes, or maybe the common man. The upper classes, particularly in Lower Egypt, spoke Greek because of the thoroughly Hellenized nature of the chief city in Lower Egypt, and that's Alexandria. But the common man spoke Coptic, hence the necessity for early Christianity in Egypt to have a translation of the New Testament in the language of the common man. So that's a point of, and a note of interest right there. The upper classes spoke Greek. So they had a Bible. They had the Septuagint, and they had other Greek translations, at least of the Old Testament, that were available. And probably, no doubt, they had copies of the copies of the copies of the Greek autographs of the New Testament. So it's no problem for them as far as the Scriptures are concerned. Either the New or the Old, they would have those in Greek. The common man, it's another question, particularly the common man, the regular Copt, the native Egyptian, the indigenous character who's found down in southern or upper Egypt. It's going to be something entirely different for him then. Coptic language was finally supplanted by Arabic in the 10th century. And that is why, one reason among several in the future, and I think one or two in the past, why we got off in the last teaching when looking at the Palestinian and George Lemsa's Syriac Bibles into looking at the rise of Mohammedanism, the Arabs, because I said that the Arabic language and the Arabic culture was going to greatly influence Christianity. It's going to greatly influence that part of the world, and of course it has down to this day. It's an Arab world, all in North Africa, all in the Middle East. It's all in an Arab world there. And it would be an Arab European continent had they not lost to Martel in the Battle of Tours in 732 A.D. It survived only in a few places, the language, among the common people down until the 17th century, when finally the last speaker of Coptic died in the year 1633. The last regular speaker, the last common man who was a speaker of Coptic died in 1633. So he said that the language was totally supplanted by Arabic in the 10th century. But from the 10th to the 17th, Coptic survived in a few scattered places among the common people, down until the 17th century when the last regular speaker of the language died in 1633. So, technically, it's referred to as a dead language. However, that doesn't mean that it's not spoken today. It's no language of a national or ethnic group of people, but it is a liturgical language used of the Egyptian Christian minority church, which is referred to as the Coptic Church. It's the language of the liturgy of the Egyptian Christian minority church. Minority, of course, because the Arabs are in control of Egypt. You see, too many people criticize, and it's valid criticism, but I think a lot of it stems from a naive notion of what's going on in the rest of the parts of the world. A lot of people are highly critical, especially, let's say, pre-Vatican II, highly critical of the Roman Catholic Church and her use of Latin in her liturgy. Why? Well, people can't understand Latin. Well, you see, the Roman Catholic Church began basically in Italy, and so it spoke the Latin tongue. All you have to do is research so many of these other groups. Basically, we're talking about Eastern groups. The Catholicism is really a Western church and a Western religion since it began the western part. Italy is considered, by the way, the western part, not the eastern part of Europe. But you could check the any other language. Here's a good case right here, the Coptic language. It is still used, it's spoken, it's part of the liturgy, only among the priests and whatever I don't know the titles by which they go, but the pastors, the priests or whatever, in the Egyptian Christian minority church, which in Egypt to this day, I mean, it's like a fraction of 1% of the population in this large country of Egypt, but they still, to this day in the Coptic church, use in the liturgy the Coptic tongue. So Roman Catholicism is no isolated case, that needs to be criticized. And I'm not in favor of Roman Catholicism. I'm not trying to take up for their practice, especially in the past, of insisting on using what they felt was a holy language, because looking here at the Copts in Egypt, for them the Coptic tongue is the holy tongue. That was the original tongue of their church whenever their church began. Same thing is true with Latin. Same thing is true with we Americans. The language of the church whenever the colonies were founded was English, and so we continue with English today. And we don't say, oh, no, that's a bad thing because you use that in your liturgy. Of course, it just so happens that the people are able to understand the preachers in English in America today, and that generally doesn't happen in Catholic circles in America today, Catholic churches, or in Coptic ones in Egypt. Why? Because the common man doesn't speak Coptic anymore. The only ones who know it, and they don't know it like it should be known, because the last regular speaker who was conversant in the language died in 1633. So think how many things have changed with the Coptic language from 1633 to 1983, let's say. A lot has changed. There's no way you could still have the connection that the man in 1633 had with the original Coptic tongue as compared to the man who lives today. So that's an interesting point I just thought I'd throw in so it would broaden your knowledge of what goes on in other churches. And there are many, many examples. And some of these I'm sure we'll come across even later. But here's our best and our earliest and our first example of this, of a church that uses a different language in its liturgy that the people cannot understand at all. I mean, you're familiar with what I'm saying about Roman Catholicism, but that's supposed to be one of the great, great points that we Protestants have against the Catholics. Well, that's just not thinking very deeply. I mean, they're not thinking very deeply to speak in Latin when no one can understand, but that's just the common practice of churches all over the world. And we Americans aren't really any different. It's just that our language, English, happens still to be current today, and current in this place and with these people to whom we're speaking. And for the Christian minority church, the Egyptian Christian minority church in Egypt, it's not that way at all. Now, I said earlier minority because it's an Islamic country. You know that without me telling you that. It's Christianity. What type of Christianity do we have? We have good evangelical Southern Baptist beliefs? Hardly. We have a monophysite church. We've talked about the monophysites before. Some of the monophysites during the periods of imperial persecution in Syria, because Syria was much closer to Constantinople than way down here in Upper Egypt, down near Thebes, down near Aswan, Elephantine, down near the 5th, 6th, 7th cataracts of the Nile. Then we'd have Syrian churchmen, Syrian monks and so forth, evidently fleeing down maybe to Egypt, maybe through Egypt to Nubia, or to Ethiopia, to the south of Egypt. And they carried with them, of course, the monophysite faith that they had, that they espoused back up in Syria. They're an extremely liturgical church, just like, I guess I could say, any Eastern church is. Roman Catholicism is one of the exceptions to the rule. And, of course, we have others, but none as great as the Roman Catholic Church as an exception to the rule that the Western churches, the churches of Western Christianity, are generally not known for their liturgy. And I say generally because that's only generally true. Catholicism is our most noted exception. Presbyterians mix in a little liturgy here and there, and so do the high Episcopalians in the high Episcopal Church. But over in the East, we just have liturgy after formula after formula. Coptic Church believes in 7 sacraments. Now, for any of you church history, well, I won't say buffs, I was going to say that, but I don't think we have any curiosity seekers, I'll say. You know that the Roman Catholic Church has 7 sacraments as well. And look how early we are to the 2nd century A.D. The Coptic Church has 7 sacraments. I hesitate getting too far off on this church history business. But Roman Catholicism, I may be going out on a limb to say this. I may need to check all these facts. This is what I think is true. I'll say it that way thus far. I'm pretty sure this can be proven, but it has to be proven from a lot of other source material than just church history source material. Roman Catholicism is, I was going to say it's not just one church. It is one church. There's no doubt about that. But it seems like Roman Catholicism is just the largest and the best known expression of a whole lot of undercurrents, false ascetic liturgical undercurrents of the first couple of centuries after the death of the last apostles. And it's just that Catholicism finally broke away from the rest of the pack and established itself as the dominant force in Christianity for over 1,000 years prior to, of course, the Reformation era. What I'm saying is the Copts certainly didn't get their religious beliefs from the Catholics because the Catholics didn't exist then. In other words, you might then think, well, that means the Catholics got theirs from the Copts. Not really. There's no connection between the Copts and the Catholics as far as one being dependent upon the other. How about then, if neither one of those theories is true, that we can't derive Catholicism from the Copts or the Copts from Catholicism, then how about a common source for both of them then? And they both sprang from this, as well as some other churches that sprang from this. And it's just that by a whole series of events, particularly location, I mean, down in Egypt, you're overrun by the Muslims there. Up in Italy, up in Europe, you're safe there. And that's the church that wasn't touched, basically, by the Islamic invasion in the 7th century A.D., 7th century and onward A.D. And so it was the one that finally rose dominant from the whole pack of churches that had so much in their liturgy. For instance, I'm just giving you some things I remember about the Coptic faith. They believe in prayers for the dead. Now, they didn't get that from Roman Catholicism. They're right down there in Egypt, though, where probably some of those books were written. Alexandria, some of those apocryphal works were written. They believe in prayers for and by the dead. They believe in icons. They believe in worship of saints. They believe in the Mass. Isn't that interesting? See, this goes way back prior to Roman Catholicism. And anyway, you can't date, you can't, there's no way possible you can say, okay, what was it? I think it was the year 506 A.D., June the 22nd, around 9 a.m. That's when the Catholic Church began. That's impossible. It's a whole series of events. You can't even tie it to 1 year, maybe not even 1 decade, maybe not even 1 century. When did the Roman Catholic Church really begin? And you probably couldn't for the Coptic group of people either. When did they really begin? When did all of these beliefs, these liturgical beliefs, really come into the church? That's pretty difficult, if not impossible, to say. We just know that with the death of the last of the apostles, Christianity went haywire. She did not have the infallible interpreters of Scripture before her, the holy apostles and prophets of the first century, to keep her on the straight and narrow way. And it's just taken centuries and centuries of work by all of the fallible men in the church. We don't have our holy apostles and prophets anymore, to work and work and work and dig and dig and dig and study in the Scriptures to try to come up with what's the right answer to all of these things. We were in Paul's day, we just asked Paul, you see, what's the right answer? This JDS question, this shepherdship issue, denominationalism, divine healing. Paul, is divine healing for today? Paul would be able to give us the answer. Paul would know. If we were living in Paul's day or Paul living in ours and he was the same apostle today that he was back then, he'd be able to give us the answer. Or we could go ask John. Now, he might want to teach on love for the first 15 minutes and then give us the answer to our question. He was always the one that wanted to talk about love. He was the disciple whom the Lord loved. So I guess he had a reason to enjoy the topic and the subject and the virtue of love. Or we could go ask one of the others. Don't ask Barnabas because he split from Paul one time. He might be wrong if you ask him. But well, I don't really mean them. Ask one of the apostles or prophets. But you see, we haven't had them. That's one reason why the church has been in the mess that she's been in. What happens whenever Moses dies, and then Joshua, and then the elders that outlived Joshua? We'll start reading in Judges. And you won't get to the 21st chapter before you already know what happened whenever God's holy, appointed interpreters of Scripture and leaders of the people, whenever they died and passed off the scene. And you just go through periods in history like that. And it seems like we end up with the same thing in the church. With the Reformers, we don't have apostles or prophets, but we definitely do have men in the 16th century raised up by God to bring us to a closer view of the Word of God. And then German higher criticism and extreme rationalism enters the picture in the 1800s, and we have to wrestle with that. In the beginning of this century, we get some theologians who are able to wrestle with that. And then by the time, some Protestants, and then because the Catholics, they pretty much passed off the scene as far as importance in theology is concerned. Then we get to the 1960s, we have the so-called Death of God movement, led by liberal Protestant theologians. And so we have some who've been raised up who've been able to deal with that. Well, there's a little quick lesson in biblical history there, in church history. But it seems to fit the pattern of all of the Old and New Testament, and seems to be, among others, one explanation for what happened and why it did whenever John the Apostle died. That same thing happened in the Old Testament. Whenever God's especially appointed leaders passed off the scene, then the people, they don't have a king or a prophet or a true, pious, godly, God-fearing priest to reign over them or instruct them, so every man does that which is right in his own eyes. Every man believes that which is right in his own eyes. We just have to wait for God to raise up some man who knows the Word of God, who can get us back on the right path. Let's look at the origins, next of all, of Christianity. We generally have been doing this, which puts us back into church history again, the origins of Christianity in Egypt. Now, you remember we looked at various theories. Thaddeus was sent by Jesus to King Abgar up in Syria because of a letter earlier that went between the two, and Jesus promised him healing after his ascension. There are various legends associated with all of these Eastern or Middle Eastern, whatever you want to call them, countries as to how Christianity originally came to their country. And of course, it seems like, well, some of the legends have some historical basis to them. Some don't. Probably all those who do have some historical aren't totally reliable as far as their historicity is concerned. And it seems like they all like to connect themselves with some great well-known leader, such as one of the apostles. If not one of the 12, then maybe an apostle or one of the well-known gospel writers or evangelists or prophets or teachers or whatever that came in the early first century church. And it's rather remarkable that God in His providence saw it fit to obscure so much of the later life of so many of the apostles. We could say early life. We don't really know much about Thaddeus in the Gospels. We really don't know much about him. Nothing compared to what we know about Simon Peter or John or James or even the traitor Judas Iscariot. We know more about him, a lot more about him, than we know about some of the other original 12. So I'm telling you that to tell you one of the first of various theories. We're only going to look at one of these theories because it has more basis, at least in church father writings, than some of the others, because you'll kind of already know now that we must be talking about an important figure. Who brought Christianity to Egypt? Mark. John Mark brought Christianity to Egypt. Well, now, wait a minute. Says Eusebius. Not says Brother Ross. I don't have a revelation there. I think I've got one, but I think I've got it in Acts 2 and not in Eusebius. Eusebius, HE 216, History Ecclesiastical or Ecclesiastical History. Eusebius 216 preserves some hearsay that tells us Mark founded the church. In HE 224, he implies with some statements that he makes that Mark died in Egypt. He founded the church there, and then whenever he became an old man, he died there. And he implies that he died in the 8th year of Nero's reign, which was AD 62. Jerome also says this. There's some other church writers that said this. I didn't copy their names down. Here are two important ones. Eusebius and Jerome. Jerome also said that Mark brought Christianity to Egypt, that he died there, and in the 8th year of Nero, AD 62, and that he was buried in Alexandria. That's probably the best known theory, early church history theory, I should say, as to the origins of this new religion, the country of the Pharaohs. But that seems to be totally void of any historical basis, because the great majority of other voices have Mark in Rome most of his life, which is all the difference in the world than Egypt. I'm speaking of location here. And they, of course, have him as the personal friend, companion, co-worker of the Apostle Peter. What do we have to say about that theory about Mark? Well, there's almost no doubt about the fact that that is true, and it can be proven not just from church history sources, but from Mark and Peter's writings as well. I can give you some passages if you want some passages. We're really not into that, but 1 Peter, well, the first one I'll have to look up, and the second one will be easy to give you. Passages that support the fact that Mark was not in Egypt. He was with Peter wherever Peter was. We know Peter was in Rome. 1 Peter 5:13 give you some of Peter's writings, and if you want some of Mark's, that'd be Mark. That's all, Mark, the whole gospel. That's why I said that would be easy to give. I wanted to look that up. I think it's 16 chapters. Now, I'm not being facetious. I really mean that. The whole Gospel of Mark, if you study it very, very carefully, and we'll do that sometime, you can see Petrine influence. You can see traces of Petrine thought and of Petrine influence. There's just no doubt about that. I think I could even give you one verse if you don't want to. You're reading somewhere in the Old Testament, aren't you? In your daily Bible reading. So I'll give you a verse if you don't want to read all the way through Mark's Gospel. Mark 16:7 is a unique verse in all of the Gospels. And of course it has Peter's name. So I gave you one with Mark's name in Peter's writing, and there's one in Mark's writing with Peter's name, but it's one unlike the references to Peter in Matthew and Luke and John. But you can clearly see that in a detailed study, or you read a good volume on Mark. And I just finished reading one not long ago on Mark, that's why it's fresh in my memory, but I would have said that anyway. If you read real carefully in Mark, you can see Petrine influences, traces of Petrine influences. So it seems like Mark was not in Egypt. He was not south but north, not southeast but northwest, up in Rome with Peter. So it doesn't look like he died in the 8th year of Nero, 62. Doesn't look like he was buried in Alexandria. And therefore it certainly doesn't look like he was the founder of Christianity in Egypt. That's the best known theory in church father writings, though, is that Mark was the one who took the gospel there. No, we have our little easy way out. Some people would say this is an easy way out, and I would admit it's an easy way out, and it's not 100% reliable, but it is a suggestion, and that's Acts 2. You know, verses 9 to 11, all these people here on the day of Pentecost, what happened to these people? Well, eventually, at least some of them went back home. And with the power of Pentecost demonstrated here in Jerusalem in this second chapter of the book of Acts, we would think that these people took that power with them, Acts 1:8, took that power with them, those who did return home, back to their homeland. And so it's an easy way out because it just about covers every country and region around the Mediterranean world as being represented on the day of Pentecost in various countries by people from those countries, people indigenous to those countries, Jews, of course, who end up Jewish believers. So we have this middle verse, Acts 2:10. How hear we every man in our own tongue when we were born, where we were born. They weren't born in, they're Jews, but they weren't born in Israel. We were born in Phrygia, Pamphylia, in Egypt. There we have Egypt, Acts 2:10. So really, we don't know. We don't know the origins of Christianity, but this is a fairly good guess. We could ask ourselves, and I guess this would kind of be an important verse in church history, but we could ask ourselves, why did Luke think it's necessary? He's trying to write a whole history of the church, to list all of those nations in those 3 verses there, unless it's some hint or some clue to something that could help us out in further studies, such as the origin of Christianity in different territories there. If we don't have it specifically covered, like in the book of Acts, that the apostles went there and preached the message, and we do have a lot of that, and some of those nations are duplicated, or territories are duplicated here, and it could be dual, or it could be only the apostle, Paul, or another apostle bringing it there. But of course, you know from Acts, we don't have any recorded travels of the apostle Paul down to Egypt. Neither do we have any recorded travels of any of the apostles in the book of Acts down to the country of Egypt. If you look over in Acts chapter 18 and verse 25, there's a very interesting variant in Codex Bezique, which is a Western family. So this is what we call a Western reading in Acts 18:25. Let's start with verse 24. And we're talking about around the middle of the 1st century A.D. A certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria. Well, he certainly fits that category of Jews back there in Acts 2:10. Men who are Jews, they wouldn't be at the Feast of Pentecost if they weren't Jewish, no doubt, who were born in Egypt. Well, he was born in Alexandria, the largest at this time and most important city in Egypt. An eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord. Being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them, and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. And when he was disposed to pass into Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him, who, when he was come, helped them much which had believed through grace. And he mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly, showing by the Scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ. Okay, where did this man get his knowledge about Christianity then? He's a Jew born in Alexandria, first half of the 1st century A.D. Here's the reading, though, I wanted to give you. And it almost, it's a Western reading, so we don't know that it should be here, but we almost have this implied whether you have the reading or not. The first sentence, first part of verse 25, this man, we just were told in verse 24 he was born in Alexandria. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord. The Western reading has it like this. This man was instructed in his own country in the way of the Lord. It has that little phrase, in his own country, which tells us he got his introduction to Christianity in Egypt. Now, we don't have that in the more reliable texts, but do we really need it? What would be the suggestion anyway, even if you don't have that, in just reading verse 24 and connecting with 25 then? This man was instructed in the way of the Lord. Did he come up to Palestine before he was instructed? Or is that what brought him up to Ephesus and up to discussion in the synagogues, was that he had already been introduced to Christianity and was a follower of Christ in the sense of the teaching of John the Baptist. He was a follower in that sense. He didn't know, as we read there, the end of verse 26, the full way and the full understanding and message of Christianity, because that was given to him by Aquila and Priscilla. I copied down a quotation from Lake and Cadbury, Lake's Beginnings of Christianity. It's kind of a liberal book, but it's written back in the beginning of this century, the first few decades, and he's the leading authority from the liberal point of view on that. In Cadbury, Streck, Billerbeck, and Cadbury, they are the well-known authorities on rabbinical studies, just about everything you read. If you're studying the Gospels and you want to find out, now, is this in line or is this directly contrary to rabbinical thinking and method of teaching and understanding and interpreting the Scriptures, and Streck, Billerbeck, and Cadbury will generally have something to say about that. But here a statement from Lake and Cadbury on this Western reading. If this reading were right, or a correct inference, and they have in parentheses, and this is not impossible, it would prove that Christianity had reached Alexandria, and therefore Egypt, as it did Rome, not later than the year AD 50. So just from what we said in Acts 2:10, along with this variant Western reading in Acts 18:25, as long as in addition to the accepted text here in Acts 18 verses 24 and 25, would appear like Christianity reached Egypt through anonymous sources, the first half of the 1st century AD. Christianity had to have been established very, very early in Egypt. Another line of evidence substantiating this early dating for the introduction to Christianity in Egypt would be the discovery of various Greek documents that have been found in Egypt. We have seen in our earlier studies numerous papyri which have come from the sands and the dry climate of Egypt. John Ryland's 457, which is P52, of course. That's the earliest portion that's extant of the New Testament. That's John chapter 18, just a little slip of paper of papyrus. It gives a few verses from John 18, and it dates from AD 125. To be translating the Scriptures and having the Scriptures available down there at such an early date would mean Christianity had to come before this by quite some period of time. We have many other papyri that date from AD 200 or earlier, such as P46, P64, P66, P67, and P77. That last might be Oxyrhynchus, but it's still Greek and it still has to do with the New Testament documents. But especially your Beatty and Bodmer collections, as well as the Rylands collections, your P50s, P40s, and P60s. Another line of evidence, there is an LXX leaf from a codex of Genesis at Yale University that's dated AD 90. Now that's not New Testament, or that would antedate John Ryland's 457 P52 of the date of AD 125. It's an LXX leaf, so it's a Greek copy from the Old Testament, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament of Genesis found in Egypt. That's now at Yale University, that dates AD 70. Now you say, well, that's Old Testament, that's Genesis, so maybe that's a Jewish copy, because that's where these scriptures were translated originally with the Septuagint, and Jewish scribes were the ones who did it, because Christianity hadn't even come on the scene by 250 to 100 BC. So since it's Genesis and it's not the New Testament, so what that it dates AD 90? That doesn't prove to us that Christianity had to come prior to that time. Well, it does if you think of this, that the Jewish scribes were much more prone. They insisted upon having their scriptures in scroll form. And the Christians, as soon as it was possible in certain locales, went from the scrolls to codices because they were much easier to use. Of course, they weren't bound by a long history of tradition like the Jewish scribes were, and they wanted things in scrolls. What I said, this was a leaf of a codex of the book of Genesis, in Greek, dating AD 90. Now you understand what I'm saying? That means a Christian scribe. Now he could have been a Christian Jewish, but he has to be a Christian scribe to have done this, because it's not a slip of papyrus. It's not a part of a scroll that's been torn asunder and preserved intact alone, but rather it is a full leaf from a codex. Now, of course, you can write a codex on papyrus. I'm not saying that. Generally, they're written on parchment. That comes later, of course. You could write it on papyrus, but it's still a codex. It's very obvious that it's a leaf from a codex. Although it is from Old Testament, it had to have been done by a Christian writer. Or the odds are it was done by a Christian writer, not a Jewish one. Another line of evidence, we're just still discussing the origins of Christianity, because you see, we have to know when Christianity is there and some of the ins and outs of that before we're going to end up with a translation of the Scriptures into Coptic for the native people there. Obviously, we'd have Greek first because everyone in Alexandria is going to be speaking Greek. But the Coptic is something else entirely. Another line of evidence is the development of monasticism. Monasticism in Christianity, which I think in ethics we just described as Christian asceticism, quote, end of quote, is what monasticism was. It began in Egypt, the end of the 3rd century, the late 200s A.D., under one Antony, A-N-T-O-N-Y. One early Sunday morning in a small rural church in southern Egypt, the pastor was reading the text from Matthew 19:21. I can quote it, but I will read it to you. Matthew 19:21. Jesus said unto him, If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me. And Antony was sitting there in that church that Sunday morning listening to that, and he took that seriously, and he took it literally. He forsook all that he had and began the widespread movement of monasticism in early Christianity. You say, now how do we really know all of that happened? Because his biographer, Athanasius, was also a childhood acquaintance of his. And he knew the specific details of what caused Antony to do what he did. Okay, Antony was from Upper Egypt, a small rural church in southern Egypt. Those people, especially if you were of the common nature, which Antony was, did not speak Greek. Following what's my conclusion then? Therefore, at the end of the 3rd century, the late 200s A.D., how did he know what Matthew 19:21 said? Unless the preacher was reading or preaching in the Coptic language, which is the only language that Antony would have understood, because only the upper class people in Alexandria, which is lower Egypt, would have understood the Greek language and the Greek tongue. Now, of course, it could be suggested, this is one way out of proving that Christianity is really fully developed here by this time, maybe his pastor, whoever was the one reading the Scriptures, maybe his pastor or the priest or the teacher or the leader or whatever there, maybe he could speak Greek, and therefore he read the Scriptures in Greek, since that was the language in which they were preserved in the New Testament, and then would have given his paraphrase, like the Aramaic Targumim, then would have given the sense in the Coptic tongue for the local people who were part of his church. But that doesn't seem very likely, though. It doesn't seem likely that the pastor would know this and that Antony himself would not. So it's been suggested, and it's probably true, that they had manuscripts before them that Sunday morning written in the Coptic language. And when he read Matthew 19:21, go and sell all, in the Coptic language, Antony was so impressed by that. Here's the way to salvation. You know, it's a works religion. If thou wilt be perfect. And he took Jesus literally and failed to understand some things before he took off and did what Jesus said, go do. If you will be perfect, go and sell all, give to the poor, and come and follow me. Antony didn't really do all of that. He went and he sold all and he gave to the poor, and he didn't follow Jesus, but he followed himself out into the wilderness and sat up on top of a big pillar and let it rain and the birds nest in his hair so he could get close to God. So I don't know if that's following Jesus, you see. To follow Jesus is to follow his word, and he followed his own ideas about God's word. But anyway, there's the origins for monasticism, and evidently we've got scriptures that have been translated from Greek over into the Coptic language. So we know that although Mark, the theory of Mark, Eusebius and Jerome and other people's reports, the theory of Mark being the founder of Christianity is no doubt incorrect. Nevertheless, we do know that Christianity must have reached Egypt by the time of Mark's life, therefore Mark's death. Christianity has to be there probably prior to the time of Mark's death, but it was not taken by or through Mark, but rather through some anonymous individuals. Now that all we're going to say really about the origins of Christianity. That gets us introduced to who the people are, the Copts, what they're doing, their origins, what their thought pattern is like. Remember I said that they are a group of people basically who hold to the monophysitism doctrine. They do not believe in the two natures of Christ. They believe in only one nature, and they have all of these liturgies in their church. Now the Coptic language is not just one language. It evidently began that way, but it ended up divided into several dialects. And the scriptures that are preserved today in the Coptic tongue generally go by the names of one of these dialects. They generally will not just be referred to as Coptic. It's Coptic as the name of the family, I guess we could say. These dialects differ chiefly in phonetics and to a lesser degree in vocabulary and syntax. Chiefly in phonetics and to a lesser degree in vocabulary and syntax. What caused the multiplication of dialects under this one family of languages, the Coptic tongue? Probably topographical concerns, just like what happened in Greece. If you can remember, a long time ago in the intertestamental period study, we studied some of the early foundations and history of the Greek people. We discussed how mountainous the terrain was in Greece, particularly in Achaia, which is the southern part. You have more plains when you get up north in Macedon. But Achaia is all of the southern part, not including the Peloponnese, but all down where Athens is. Athens would be the chief city in Achaia. Topographical concerns. The mountainous terrain was what served to separate the people so that the country of Greece was made up of countless strong fortified city-states where a group of people would take over a valley and there form their city. And the mountains were so high on all sides, those people became isolated. They spoke the Greek language, but they spoke a funny dialect, a little bit different than the Greeks on the other side of the mountain chain who took over another valley, and instead, therefore, of having, a great country known as the country of Greece with the Greek people here, we have a very divided country with many dialects, with many city-states controlling the country. That's, of course, why we have the importance of Philip of Macedon. He was the one who served to unify the country, and we could never have had the wars fought against the Persians by Alexander the Great and his Greeks if we would not have had Philip of Macedon who brought unity to the diversity that existed in Greece at that time. We don't have mountains in Egypt. We don't have mountains. I said topographical considerations are probably what initiated the various dialects. We don't have mountains, but we do have the chief feature of the country of Egypt, which is what? The Nile River. What's it known for? The Nile River. People living on different sides of the Nile, people living at different cataracts, not Cadillacs or cataracts on the ice, but the rocky part where the Nile River is shallow, the different cataracts in the Nile. When you go from the plush, fertile region of Lower Egypt, which is in the Nile Delta, all of it's always overflowing there, it's all plush, way down to southern Egypt and upper Egypt, and here you have nothing but sand as far as you can see. You don't have the plush tropical life. You're going to have a different group of people there. The way you're going to travel, basically, if it's not by camel caravan, will be on the Nile. But that is a long, long way. How long is the Nile? 4,000 miles. It's the longest river in the world. Flows uphill for us on the globe. It flows from the south to the north, really not uphill, but it looks like it does. 4,000 miles long. We're going to have a lot of people scattered over the banks of the Nile. A lot of different people who speak Coptic, but who speak various sub-dialects that come underneath Coptic. And I guess that's a good place to end, so we don't have to get into all of those dialects. We'll start with the dialects next time. Until last century, the end of last century, scholars really thought there were only 3, but we know there are more like 5 dialects. We'll be looking at these and the manuscripts represented by these different dialects in the next teaching then.